Hey everyone, today we're going to look at Key Concept 3.2 and we're going to focus on the emergence of political parties in America. Okay? So we're going to once again focus on 3.2. If you want to take a second and pause it, we'll be focusing on letter B for the most part is, what kind of caused these debates and, once again, how did political parties emerge. So if you want to pause it and read that, feel free. But we're going to go ahead and get started. So here's a little graphic organizer that's going to kind of run our discussion here. But for the most part, political parties emerge in America because of three main issues, and they're all somewhat connected. So I guess you could debate if it's three main issues, but for our purposes today, that's how we're going to look at it. The first one is Hamilton's economic policy is very much going to rub some people the wrong way and divide many Americans over the repayment of debts, which a lot of people are offended by, and the creation of a national bank, which many people think is unconstitutional. So that is going to once again put a wedge in between many Americans. We're also going to have this ongoing debate in American history. It's going to go for a couple decades here about who's supreme, the federal government or the state governments, and that's going to be an issue that's going to be finally settled in the Civil War. But for the first 7 decades or so of our country's existence, it very much was an issue that was talked about quite a bit, whether or not the federal government should have the last say or the state should have the last say. We also see some foreign policy conflicts, and I really should say just conflict, that once again divides Americans, and that's the French Revolution and how we have to deal with the French Revolution. Starting with, obviously the reign of terror, but then also moving into, the whole Napoleon stage and all that stuff. It very much separates Americans over that issue. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the first one, and we're just going to real quickly glance at it. But we covered this in a different lecture, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. But clearly one of the things that divides Americans is Hamilton's plan for America and then Jefferson's vision of America. And if you look at them, if you want to pause it and just take a look, if you haven't seen my previous lecture, clearly these two men and their followers kind of have a different plan for where America should go. And as a result, they're obviously going to disagree, and eventually they're going to create parties that reflect their interests, okay? But let's get to the whole federal government versus state government, okay? And let's kind of try to trace where does that come from. So the first thing we want to look at is during this period of time, the 1790s, when George Washington, our first president, is at the helm here, one of the issues that he has to deal with is the French Revolution, okay? And it puts America in a very awkward situation, okay? Because while we initially did have a treaty with the French, Washington doesn't want us to kind of pick a side. And so Washington, issues a proclamation or a neutrality proclamation saying that the United States is going to play neutral. We're not going to favor one country over the other. And while that might sound nice, the bottom line is it's probably not very practical, because what we see happening is that when American merchants are going over to Europe to trade with both the British and the French, whomever will buy our stuff, the British obviously don't want us to supply their enemy. And so the British begin seizing American ships. And when they do that, they oftentimes don't give us compensation for that, and sometimes they impress some of our sailors. And impress means to pretty much, I don't say kidnap, but pretty much to seize our people and then put them in their own military. So that's a policy that is very much going on at this time. And so obviously, many Americans are offended by this. They're like, hey, they're kind of slapping us in the face here. So clearly it's a situation that needs to be talked about. So Washington sends over one of his Federalist buddies, John Jay, over to negotiate with the British. Now, the main point, the main goal of Jay being sent over there is that Washington doesn't want us to get into a war, right? We're not at a point where we can really handle a war. We're fragilely put together right now. Our economy's kind of in shambles. But there's no way that we can do another war with the British. So we want to basically maintain peace almost at all costs. So Jay goes over there, and we really don't have much strength to negotiate with, and he ends up agreeing to a pretty embarrassing treaty. Pretty much the British maintain their right to seize our ships and our people with no compensation, and Jay agrees to it. And in return, we do get like most favored nation status, which gives us some trading privileges, what many Americans wanted. But the main goal, the main achievement of this treaty is that war is avoided. And that was really Washington's main goal, is to keep the peace. Let this republic continue to grow out of its infancy, and not get into a war that will divide it. Okay, and so Jay's Treaty, is it kind of embarrassing? Yes. Did it achieve its goal though? Yeah, it kind of did. But the reaction to the treaty is going to split Americans. I mean, many people in Congress and many people in the country, for that matter, are just shocked and embarrassed that we would sign a treaty agreeing to those terms. Okay, and it also makes the French mad, because the French, from their point of view, it looks like we're kind of being pro-British here, and that we're kind of picking sides. So that's going to lead to more problems in the future. But this is an issue that's going to divide Americans. Many people can kind of see the reasoning behind this treaty, but other people can't see the reasoning behind that treaty, and that's going to further divide Americans. Now, the other thing that's going to divide Americans is that George Washington is going to retire and soon die. And that's significant because he's like the one guy that everyone can agree, like, that guy's the man, right? Everyone loves Washington. In fact, Jefferson was quoted as one time saying, the country will only hold together if we have you to hold on to. And so once Washington steps out, here we're going to see how divisive presidential politics can be. So when Washington was elected in 89 and 92, he was elected unanimously, right? Because everyone loved him. But 1796 and 1800, we see Jefferson and Adams go at it, a Federalist versus Democratic Republican. And we all know what presidential politics can be like. It's nasty. It's ugly. We've all seen these campaign commercials before, right? I mean, it creates tension within communities, and obviously that's going to lead to partisan politics. And so the elections of 1796, the elections of 1800, they're both really nasty elections. And plus, our rules initially with the Electoral College and how presidential elections went, it kind of didn't make much sense. Like in 1796, the rule was that the loser would become the vice president. So John Adams wins a narrow victory, and then the loser, Thomas Jefferson, has to be his vice president. I mean, how awkward is that? You have the resistance to the Federalists as the vice president, so he's going to be pretty much undermining Adams at pretty much every single point. So it's not really a good situation. In the election of 1800, we have more shenanigans taking place because Jefferson and the other Democratic Republican Burr each receive identical votes, because this time around they're like, hey, it's kind of silly to have the loser be the vice president. So their idea was, why don't we just give every elector 2 votes so they can vote for 2 people, and then those 2 people will be the president and the vice president, and they basically figured that they would be the same party, right? Well, it kind of works, because the people with the 2 most votes were Jefferson and Burr, but they tied. So technically, who was going to be the president? If Jefferson had 73 votes and Burr had 73 votes, who was going to win? Now, everyone knew that Jefferson was running for president, and everyone knew that Burr was going to be the vice president. But the Federalists were like, haha, we gotcha. And so the Federalists actually kind of do some shenanigans in the House of Representatives, and for a while it seems like they're trying to basically throw the presidency at Aaron Burr, okay? Just to kind of snub Jefferson, okay? But eventually Hamilton, who's the leader of the Federalists, is like, you know what, Burr's kind of crazy, and while I hate Jefferson, Burr is just kind of a train wreck, and he would do a horrible job. And so, because of that, Burr doesn't get the presidency, Jefferson does, and Burr and Hamilton will then kind of start this weird relationship that will end in a duel where Burr kills Hamilton. So, yeah, presidential politics most definitely led to partisan politics in America. Okay, so here we see the election of 1796. Adams becomes president. Kind of going back to the French Revolution here. We got to kind of soothe some French nerves here after the Jay's Treaty. And so Adams sends some delegates over to France to kind of negotiate with them to make sure that we can maintain the peace. It doesn't go very well. We have the XYZ affair, in which the French demand a bribe from the American delegates in order for us to have the right to talk to them. We obviously say no. We go home. It becomes a big scandal. The Federalists are like, yeah, I told you the French kind of stink, right? They're our enemies, right? And so For a time, it appears that there's going to be a war between the French and the Americans, and the Federalists start getting ready for war. They get President Washington to come back and be the general of the American army. We start designing uniforms and training and getting everything ready. And the Federalists also say, you know what, now that we're going to war against the French, we got this quasi-war going on where our ships are kind of already fighting. We need to make sure that we're unified, right? And so the Federalists decide to pass a series of laws infamously known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. Okay, these are 4 separate laws. Okay, and the Federalists say that they're aimed at creating unity in America during this war. That we need to stand together and not be divided in political parties during this war. And so that's their perspective. The Democratic Republicans be like, you know what, man, you guys are just attacking us and our civil liberties. For instance, the first law made aliens or immigrants wait 14 years before becoming citizens. The Democratic Republicans are like, what? You're going to double that from 7? Those people vote for us. And so the Democratic Republicans saw the doubling of nationalization to be, kind of an attack at their base, making it harder for them to win elections in the future. It also allowed for the president, the second and third laws that is, allowed the president to deport any immigrant that he felt was dangerous to the U.S. So without any due process, the president can just say, yep, I don't like you. You're out of here. Gone. I don't like your ideas. Peace out. The fourth law is probably the most concerning. The fourth law dealt with sedition. And basically what it stated was no one could say anything false, scandalous, or malicious against the federal government. So it basically infringed upon people's free speech. So the ink isn't even dry on the Bill of Rights, and here we see a law that is infringing on free speech. And people did go to jail for this. People did go to jail for speaking out against the government or bashing Federalists, because the Federalists pretty much made a law that said, you can't say anything bad about us because we're fighting a war, right? And that's a pretty dangerous trend. So obviously this is a very concerning law, or a series of laws that go into a place early on in our republic, and it really kind of shows how wild things were back then. How we're trying to kind of put the airplane together as we're flying here. It's kind of this very odd, very tenuous situation we have going on here. Now, eventually, cooler heads prevail, and thankfully, the Americans and the French don't go to war. I mean, yeah, there is the quasi-war where there's limited amount of naval fighting, but not really anything too serious. But we also see resistance to these laws in the form of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, and these are kind of both secretly penned by Jefferson and Madison, 2 very important Democratic Republicans. And basically, what these resolutions bring up is that these laws are unconstitutional. And as a result, states have a right to nullify federal law. And so these 2 documents, these 2 resolutions, introduce the concept of nullification. And that's unconstitutional. It eventually becomes unconstitutional. But basically, it's this proposal that states have the power over the federal government because the states created the federal government. And because the states created the federal government, sovereignty or the real power lies with the states. And so this whole idea of nullification is kind of brought up here. And it's going to be brought up for the next, couple decades. It's going to be brought up from time and time again whenever there's a constitutional crisis or whenever there's a law that certain states really kind of hate. This idea of nullification is going to pop up, okay? So anyways, we have the election of 1800 then, which is kind of a redo of 1796, and it gets really, really nasty, but this time Jefferson wins, of course, even after all the shenanigans. But it is during this election also, once again, that things get really nasty. In fact, Thomas Jefferson is publicly smeared. His private life is brought into the election. It's rumored that he had a relationship with one of his slaves, which 99.9% chance that that's true, with his slave Sally Hemings, and he had 6 children with her. 4 of them lived to adulthood. So it very much got personal in this election. But overall, all the things that we've talked about here, it's showing kind of this buildup of partisan politics and driving a wedge between the American people, much to the dismay of George Washington, who in his farewell address, when he left the presidency, he begged and he pleaded with the American people, don't break up into political parties. Don't do that. Keep your loyalties with your country and not your party. And unfortunately, obviously, it didn't take well, right? we definitely formed those political parties, and they're still around today, obviously. But here's where they all got started. So, anyways, I hope this helped, guys. Have a great day.